I'm delighted to be with you again. Some of you may be tired of seeing me. I think I've been here for the whole journey. But I do want to start by saying I want to congratulate the Asia Global Institute at the 10th anniversary. I think Victor and William for their foresight in seeing that this was an important contribution to global dialogue. For the people who have built it over the years, and especially to Hei Wai Tang and Yvonne Mack, who have taken charge of this thing. In Yvonne's case, I think we've been together through this whole journey. It's been a thrill. My role in this has essentially been to be Victor's sidekick. Before I tackle the subject that we're going to talk about for the next hour and a bit, I'd like to make one remark about the previous panel. I found it just fascinating, as I think everybody in the room did. But if you'll forgive me, I want to inject a note of realism. So let me do it with an analogy. If you have a finely tuned, well-oiled machine with lots of gears and moving parts, and then you throw sand into the gears, it will slow down. So somewhere in a world that's being subject to the shocks and blockages that we're experiencing, we're going to see an effect. And I suspect that effect is going to be slower growth, higher costs, maybe higher inflationary pressures. Now, that doesn't take away in any way the opportunities that were described so effectively in the previous thing. But I do think we have to understand that we're on a trajectory that is at least problematic. I worry terribly about the low-income countries. I hope what was described this morning is part of the salvation. But I do think that we're going to have to work hard on limiting the fragmentation of the global economy, even though we have to accept that it's not going to be the one that we lived in for the previous 4 decades or so. And I also think that technology is part of the solution to things like aging, productivity declines, and so on. So let me turn to the subject of this thing. It's called philanthropy. I think it's actually broader than that. You know, philanthropy now is kind of merging with a whole lot of other things, like ESG, like the role of business in achieving important, environmental, social, and other goals. It's merged with social entrepreneurship. There's a burgeoning batch of interest in impact investing with practitioners involved. And you're going to hear about all these things when we get to the panel discussion and listen to people who are engaged and in the middle of this. The thing that earlier this fall, the Jockey Club had a conference, a major conference on philanthropy for better cities, I think is what they called it. And a great deal of that was on essentially impact investing. But the thing that strikes me when I think about philanthropy and interact with my friends who are engaged in helping people in various ways do this effectively is the enormous range. I mean, you have philanthropy impacting, enormously big, important global issues like climate change, and you'll hear about that. But you have philanthropy making a major difference at a much, much smaller scale. I mean, there's important philanthropies saving animals that have been neglected. And then there's everything in the middle. I was an academic administrator. I did a lot of fundraising. You have hospitals. You have philanthropy surrounding virtually every disease that has a name. You have philanthropy supporting higher education in a really impactful way. And so it's just a vast territory. I'll give you one that you may not know, and this is just kind of for your interest. The National Science Foundation in the United States published data recently on how the basic research in a broad range of digital technologies, AI, quantum, etc., was being funded. Now, normally, basic research, upstream, non-proprietary research is funded mainly by government because it's hard to make a return if, there's no proprietary intellectual property. But the digital one is interestingly different. So the funding for that, this is in the United States, is 1/3 the government, 1/3 the tech giants, Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, etc., and 1/3 philanthropy. It's that last third that may surprise you. And so I find that just absolutely fascinating. So on our subject today, I think the reason why this is so interesting and important at this particular stage is that the Asian economies are becoming wealthy. And as that wealth builds, the interest in building and going down the learning curve associated with philanthropy increases. And so it couldn't be a better time to start building this in to the way we think about the progress in our societies. The motivation for people that do philanthropy is something that fascinates me. And so sometimes the motivation is just the desire to do good, to help other people. Sometimes the motivation is more along the lines of trying to make a difference in areas that are existentially important, like the climate change agenda. But I think motivation is more complicated than that, so I want to take a minute of your time and tell you what I think about that. I believe it is a social and cultural phenomenon. And so I'm not going to try to make that case in great detail, but I'll tell you a few stories. A friend of mine, actually one of my thesis advisors, wrote a book called The Patron's Payoff. And that book, what that book was about, is something probably most of you have never thought about, which is the following. In the Italian Renaissance, there was an enormous flowering of art, architecture, sculpture, finance. It was an unbelievable period of innovation. So the question they asked is, who financed all that? And what were their motivations? And the answer is fascinating. The answer came out something like this. The church, which was a dominant institution, this is the Catholic Church, needed to fund their activities, including building lots of churches and cathedrals. There was a wealthy group of people, and they wanted to distinguish themselves in terms of not only their wealth, which is a motivation that you can quibble with, but also piety. And then there were all these people, that needed to be funded to do the Raphaels, the Michelangelos, and Caravaggios, who needed support to do their work. And so what happened was the church sold essentially access to the chapels in the churches to wealthy families. And their names got put on the chapels. And then they turned around, so that funded the church. Their names got put on the chapels, so they got the recognition for this, and it went with both wealth and piety. And then they turned around and essentially funded the artists and sculptors and so on. And so it's a rather impressive little ecosystem that accomplishes two things. It at least augments the incentive with respect to philanthropy. It provides a signaling mechanism that I think is pretty important in the context of motivating philanthropic giving, even though you might wish it was purely, from the bottom of your heart. I just don't think that's realistic. The closest analogy I can think of in the United States is something some of you have maybe encountered. In New York, there's something called the Met Gala. It's the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and it is supported heavily by the major wealthy people in the United States, and they have a highly visible event in which the movie stars and everybody else who, shows up. And and if you think about it, it's essentially the analog of the Renaissance story, right? You get the signaling effect. You get support for the people who are doing sort of fashion design because people buy unbelievable amounts of fancy stuff and whatnot. And the Metropolitan is the kind of primary target, gets a significant amount of financial support from this. And so what I want to leave you with is the following idea. Recognition is important. And one of the things that concerns me is that the signaling mechanisms are very different depending on what the target of the philanthropy is. So it's easier in higher education, it's easier for the Met Gala. If you're running a rather smaller operation that's doing impactful work, for people who are homeless and probably barely eating, it's not obvious that you have the same incentive structure. And I think there's some at least I've urged all of us to think carefully about being creative, about creating those mechanisms. The last thing I want to say about this comes from my experience in higher education. I don't think that a complete understanding of philanthropy can be achieved without paying attention to the kind of social norms. Or put it differently, I think philanthropy is intimately connected with the sort of value structure that gets built culturally into the world we live in. So and it's not just impact, for sure. So let me give you an example. I'm raising money for Harvard. At the time, I'm Dean of the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And I go to people, and many of them say, sure, I'll support you. A few say, why should I give money to Harvard with a $50 billion endowment? Is that the high impact, at the margin source of my philanthropy? To which I would respond, if you think there's a more important place to put your philanthropic resources, God bless you, go and do it, right? But that's not the way the system works, right? When I go to a Harvard alum and ask for money, they never say to me, gee, I think it would be better if it went to the University of Pennsylvania, right? You kind of get this, that what there is in America, and it's turned out to be an enormously important source of the funding of a pretty impressive higher education system, is a set of obligations that you come. And everybody knows what that system is, right? You support the institution you went to. If you think that that's not all of your philanthropy, you do many other things, but it's kind of built into the system. And it's not impact investing in the narrow sense of the term. It's impacting in the sense that you understand the system and then participate in it because it yields strength in important institutions. So I wanted to put that out on the table because I think sometimes the view of philanthropy is, especially when you get involved in these detailed discussions of impact investing, and I'm not against impact investing at all, you lose track of the sort of social network, social fabric, structures that we build, and they get built over time, right? This is deliberate. It's not an accident that you end up in these with these structures that incentivize in different ways. Sometimes it's the signaling one. Sometimes it's the, you learn at a very early age that this is part of the responsibility you have, or sometimes it's referred to as giving back. So that's what I wanted to say about the philanthropy. Now, we're going to have a panel, and we're going to talk about sustainability, I think, in a fair amount, and that's probably on the top of everybody's list as what's important. We're going to talk about helping people think about their philanthropic activity as their wealth increases, and I hope that discussion, has at least some overlap with what I've been talking to you about. because I think building these social norms is an important part of the philanthropic enterprise, and not just the kind of individual gets wealthy and the time has come to move on. And I base that on the observation of really substantial differences across countries and societies in terms of the way this works. But there are other examples. For example, in the Muslim world, it's an explicit part of the religion that once you achieve a certain level of income and wealth, a significant fraction of that, you know, on the order of 10% a year, goes to what we would call philanthropic activities, which is support of the less fortunate people in the society. So, could we move on to the panel at this point? Do I need to turn it back over to you, or? But thank you.
Thank you, London. Please remain seated. Yes, please remain seated, Professor Spence. Thank you. I would like to now invite on stage our esteemed panelists that are going to be joining Professor Spence. May I please request Mr. Hakan Bulguru, the CEO of BECO, to join the stage, please? Oh, how are you? Thank you. May I request Dr. Yun Ma, Chairman and President of Hong Kong Green Finance Association, to please join us? May I then lastly request Mr. Lok Yim, the Regional Head of Global Private Banking of HSBC Asia Pacific. May we please warmly welcome them. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me first introduce the panel, for those of you who haven't read the resumes. On my immediate left is Hakan Bulguru. That's perfect. All right. It's a tongue twister for, you know, me. But Hakan is the CEO of, is it BECO or BECO? BECO Corporation. This is a manufacturer globally of home appliances. It's a famous company because it routinely comes at the very top of the list in terms of sustainability indices. I think you've been at the top of the list in the Dow Jones thing 5 years in a row?
6 now.
6 now. We're out of date on data. Hakan has also, you know, been part of an important initiative at the World Economic Forum. It's a group of CEOs who are committed to making business an important part of the solution in terms of achieving sustainability. And then he has this additional feature on his resume that he's climbed Mount Everest, and he's climbed a mountain in Antarctica, and then gone to the South Pole. So hopefully we'll hear a little bit about that on the way through. Anyway, welcome. On to his immediate left is Jun Ma, or Dr. Jun Ma. I guess in Chinese it's Ma Jun, right? Okay. We'll do English for now. And Dr. Ma is, I think, probably one of the most important people in China in terms of advancing the environmental agenda, the sustainability agenda, with a particular focus on finance. So he is the chairman and president in Hong Kong of the Green Finance Association. And then there's a list of things that he leads in China, which is very long, so forgive me. He's the chairman of the Green Finance Committee of the China Society for Finance and Banking, the president of the Institute of Finance and Sustainability, a member of the National Expert Committee for the Ministry of Ecology and Environment of the People's Republic of China, and it goes on like that. Maybe I don't have to read the whole thing. Anyway, he is clearly a leader here in Asia in an incredibly important dimension of achieving environmental sustainability. So it's a thrill to have you here. And then finally, on the far left, my far left, your far right, is Mr. Lok Yim. He is the regional head of global private banking at HSBC. He joined HSBC within, I think, the last couple of years, right?
1 year.
1 year. Before that, he was at Deutsche Bank, and he is the regional head of HSBC's global private banking for the Asia Pacific. And he leads a team of people who help people manage wealth. And as part of helping people manage their wealth, you know, especially the high net worth folks, he helps them think carefully about their philanthropic giving and how to think about all that. So we're going to get into that territory as well. So I think we'll start with the sustainability in two dimensions. We'll start with Dr. Ma on the financial side, and then move to Hakim on the question of what does business do, and it's a lot, to materially advance the sustainability agenda, and what does it need to do in the future. Dr. Ma, over to you.
Thank you very much, Professor Spence. I think I'll kick off with a few words on green finance, sustainable finance, which has to do with philanthropy, but it's not philanthropy. Most of the green finance provided by private sector investors, including the ones you serve, and they need money back, plus some return. But there's a linkage between philanthropy and sustainable finance, which is philanthropy can be used as a catalyst for crowding in more private sector money and for leveraging some of their money. Now, let me describe probably this sort of ecosystem of green finance and to see how philanthropy fits in. I typically use what I call 4 pillars to describe a functional green or sustainable financial system. One is the definition of green activities. You need to make sure that everybody agree on what is green and what is sustainable. Otherwise, you end up with a lot of greenwashing. Typically, this takes form of taxonomy. And now, as I'm going to elaborate, about 75 countries are having taxonomies, and all in the process of developing taxonomy. It's a big table listing all the green sustainable activities. And the second pillar is disclosure requirement. We used to do that in China back 10 years ago when I was joining the PBOC as chief economist, a requirement for the green project owners to disclose environmental benefits information. Namely, you say you do environmental, create environmental benefits, but tell me how much, pollution you can reduce, how much carbon you can reduce, how much energy saving you can achieve. That kind of information need to be disclosed. Now we are moving towards ISSB-based disclosure standard, which is on the entity level. I'm sure your company will have to disclose on the ISSB base. And it's a sort of a complete set of ESG information from governance, to strategy, to all the indicators and so on. And the third piece is the financial products, which will help channel the money, including private sector, the government money, philanthropy money, to the green sustainable projects. And I personally been working on the Chinese green financial system for the past 10 years. I can proudly say that about 7-8 years ago, we kicked off a framework. I left the drafting of the Chinese Green Finance Guideline 2016, and by now, China has developed the largest green lending market with 35 trillion RMB outstanding, and the largest green bond market, 2-point-something trillion RMB. So it's about $5.5 trillion US outstanding. And these instruments really fueled the massive growth of the green economy, such as renewables, electric vehicles, batteries, and so on. And that's why I think it's also causing some of the frictions, US and Europe and so on, because, the Chinese, these industries are too powerful. The last piece is really incentives, because a lot of green projects initially do not make enough money to attract private sector attention. But the government still want them to invest because they deliver environmental benefits, climate benefits, social benefits, and so on and so forth. So how do I sort of induce the private sector to participate? Just give you a simple example. An insurance company needs a return of 5%. And this project can only deliver 4% return. So what we can do, for example, in the case of mainland China, is the central bank can provide a funding facility, which we call decarbonization facility, through the commercial banks and lend to the green projects at a lower cost than the market, which means that reducing the funding cost and enhancing the ROE for the project, which will help achieving this 5% target for private sector investment. And the second thing some of the local Chinese governments doing is provide interest subsidies. If you are qualified the green projects, I subsidize part of interest payments, which does the same thing. And third thing you can do is philanthropies. If some of the philanthropy money wants to come in to subsidize, in a small way, this project, either interest payments or maybe project preparation, TA, and so on, it can leverage 100 times of private sector money. So this system is what I call the incentive system. Of course, there are many others, including the carbon markets. If we structure well, then those projects reduces carbon can get some money back from the compulsory or voluntary carbon markets. Now, let me say a few words on what philanthropy can consider doing in a number of areas which I regard as public goods for global sustainability, including green sustainable finance. Now, these are 4 initiatives which I'm personally involved. One is in the green finance space, we were trying to create a internationally recognized approach to define green activities. This is what I call taxonomy in my early introduction. And China was the first one to came up with taxonomy. In 2015, I led the drafting of the first Chinese taxonomy for green finance. And then Europe came up with a taxonomy about 4 or 5 years ago. And at that time, we realized that it looks like every single country will come up with their own taxonomy, which defines what green activity is in a different way. If we end up with 190 taxonomies, it's a 190 language spoken in the same market, right? It creates a lot of problems. Number one, market segmentation. Your green bond labeled against, for example, Chinese taxonomy will not be bought by the Europeans because they don't recognize your green as my green. And that's market segmentation. Second problem is the increased transaction cost if you want to do cross-border transaction. If you want to sell in China, you do a Chinese labeling, Chinese verification. If you want to sell in Europe, you do another round of labeling verification. If you want to sell in a third market, you do another verification. So to address this problem, which I call a public goods, global public good, 4 years ago, we launched a common ground taxonomy initiative between China and Europe. I had the honor to co-chair this working group under the International Platform for Sustainable Finance. And 2 years later, China and Europe jointly published the Common Ground Taxonomy, which is the same definition of green activities, including 72 items of mitigation activities such as renewables, electric vehicles, batteries, water treatment, and so on and so forth. And that Common Ground Taxonomy was used in the last 2 years by cross-border transaction already, including a lot of Hong Kong financial institutions have been arranging these Chinese bonds labeled against the Common Ground Taxonomy. So that was a facilitation or lowering the transaction cost of cross-border capital flows, green capital flows. And last week I was in Baku during the COP29. I was announcing the new version of the Common Ground Taxonomy, which is called multi-jurisdiction Common Ground Taxonomy. So it's no longer China-European bilateral collaboration. It's China, Europe, and Singapore. 3 parties come together. We form the same language or same definition of green activities. And I'm hoping this MCGT, multi-jurisdiction Common Ground Taxonomy, will be further used by the financial community to facilitate cross-border transaction, not just between China and Europe, but between the entire Asia and the developed markets. That's one example of so-called public goods that we need in this space. The second example is, I think I told a couple of you that China-US been, fighting a lot of things, right? Victor been, focusing on a lot of the conflicts, trade conflicts, and a lot of other fearing about technology, geopolitics, and so on. But there's one big space which both governments agree to collaborate. And they repeat the statement many, many times, that's climate. Now, exactly which areas of climate can we collaborate? They did not elaborate. And that's why even in climate-related space, for example, solar equipment, wind equipment, electric vehicle, battery, we don't see much collaboration. And the Chinese company wanting to invest in the US are afraid of being sanctioned at some point. And maybe the projects will be viewed as threatening US national security. For example, some Americans were saying, hey, when Chinese EVs are driving on the road of US cities, this EV is sending the data back to Beijing. Yeah. This is a type of problems facing the climate-related collaboration. And what we want to do under the China-US climate finance track 2 dialogue, which I led a delegation from China to US back a few months ago, is to develop what I call wide list of climate finance collaboration, which means that in this list, the both sides, especially the government, should recognize the benefits of collaboration and protecting them from being threatened by national security concerns or other non-economic considerations. And now initially we thought it's a long list, and we came up with a list of 40 items. And before we went to the US for discussion, after 3 days, we're now shrinking it to about 10. The areas, the big ones, are not feasible. Electric vehicles, that's not feasible. Batteries, not feasible. The solar wind equipment, not feasible. Partly because of the US side of national security concern, partly because they think China's too dominant in market positioning. If I buy your stuff in these areas, I'm over-reliant on your supply. That's threatening my resilience. Then we narrow down to a couple of smaller items, for example, food waste treatment and plastic recycling, construction waste recycling, and the decarbonization of data center. These are the type of things which we think can collaborate. There are interests from the US side, including the policy advisors. So that's another area we're advancing our agenda, hoping that we can still creating some space for recoupling between China and US, rather than see a complete decoupling of all economic activities, including the climate space. The third example is called green trade policy, which is in comparison to the CBAM. I'm not sure, Professor Spencer, you focused on the CBAM implication for emerging markets. The CBAM, according to Europe, is to prevent carbon leakage, which is a legitimate concern, I think. But the impact, according to our model, is that it hurts a lot of developing country emerging markets. Because these developing country emerging markets exporting carbon-intensive products to Europe will have to pay high taxes. And these developing countries' income will go down, the ability to tackle climate issue will go down as a result of CBAM. So even though it speed up the entire world's decarbonization, the income distribution impact is negative on developing countries. What I want to see is a new approach to decarbonize the world. At the same time, everybody wins, including developing country. And this is what we call green trade policy. And I try to think about way of applying this to RCEP, which is a regional trade agreement here between China and some other northern Asian countries versus ASEAN. Now, my proposal is that currently RCEP has a schedule of cutting tariff to zero for most of the goods within 10 years. Let's think about possibility of cutting tariff to zero on green goods within 5 years, which means that we will lower tariff on those goods which can deliver environmental and carbon benefits, and therefore encouraging the production and trading of these goods within this RCEP trading bloc. And we can design the approach in such a way that every country benefits, because you can play around the list of the green goods, and you can play around the schedule of the tariff reduction. So if we do that, I think we find a new approach of dealing with decarbonization through a positive trade policy. Yeah. And the final example of what I call global public goods in the space is capacity building. A lot of developing countries, they see huge demand for sustainable investment, but the funding gap is massive. Somewhere in ASEAN, it's about 80%, which means that 80% of the needed funding for renewables and so on cannot be met. And one of the key bottlenecks, I think, is capacity, lack of capacity in designing the projects, for example, creating bankable green projects, lack of design capability to design the standards, such as taxonomy, the disclosure requirements, financial products, and many other things. That's why a few years ago, we began to kick off some capacity building for emerging markets, and last year, we officially launched the CASI initiative, which is called Capacity Building Alliance of Sustainable Investment. It was hosted by my institute in Beijing, and we also have a CASI office in Hong Kong. And indeed, this is a philanthropy-funded operation. HSBC and Standard Chartered, their philanthropy arm are funding us, the CASI program. And our aim is to train 100,000 green finance professionals in emerging markets by 2030. And year to date, we trained 5,000 already. And this kind of initiative I think is very much needed to really scale up sustainable finance flows into developing country and also the local capacity to generate green money. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's great. Just for those of you who might not know what CBAM is, it's the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. And it's an example of the kind of trade-offs that we face. So the Europeans are obviously afraid because the Europeans have a reasonably well-established set of carbon prices that many other places, including the United States, don't have. And so they're worried that this biases the balance in trade against their own industry. So this is, in a sense, it's a very clumsy, hard to implement mechanism that's not first best. I think all of us would agree. But you have to live in the world you live in. So anyway, for what it's worth, that's that component of what Dr. Ma just talked about. Hakan, over to you.
Thank you. One of the taglines of this panel was doing good and making money at the same time. 10 years ago, when I became CEO, it was very, very difficult to do good and relatively easy to make money. Today, thanks to my Chinese competitors, it's very, very difficult to make money, but easy to do good. Beko, I'll talk about Beko a little bit because I want you to understand the context and why scale is important. Beko today is the second largest appliance manufacturer in the world, largest in Europe. But what we're most proud of is its sustainability leadership globally, not only in our industry, but we're an example to other industries as well, because we have voluntarily, in the absence of regulation, really cleaned up the business. Now, what does cleaning up the business mean? Victor earlier mentioned that factories need to actually clean up their act in the manufacturing process and really keep an eye out for the carbon they're putting in the atmosphere. This is important for all of us. I wear a pin which says 1.5 degrees. I'm very worried because we've already surpassed 1.5 degrees, which was a target set for many, many years later. And now that target is trying to be changed for 2 degrees, and I'm vehemently against that because I'm worried that 2 degrees may change to 2.5 degrees, and we are nowhere near controlling the carbon we're putting into the atmosphere. It's at 421 million parts at the moment per million, and that is so far away from where it needs to be to stop global warming that we are all in serious trouble here. Now, what does that mean in terms of a business's responsibility? When I say we cleaned up our act, we decarbonized our business. And I was very proud of that. We were patting ourselves on the back. We were being recognized worldwide for actually becoming carbon neutral. But what does that mean? That was actually becoming carbon neutral in all of our manufacturing processes, scope 1 and 2. Actually, all that matters is scope 3. And just to walk you through what that means, scope 1 and 2 is everything you emit while you're manufacturing, and scope 3 is what the product consumes in its lifetime. In our case, at Beko, 98% of our emissions are scope 3. So when I was bloating, or running around and boasting, saying, we're carbon neutral, it was only on that 2%. Then, about 10 years ago, there was a big personal change for me. I took my children to Maya Bay, which is very near, dear to my heart in Thailand. I wanted to show them the pristine beaches, and when I took them on the beach, I was in knee-deep plastic. And my daughter, who was a baby at the time, child, looked up at me and said, "Why?" I couldn't answer that. And I was actually running a platform which is largely responsible for that. I mean, manufacturing appliances is a very dirty business. And the amount of carbon you put in the atmosphere is among the worst. It's like the cement steel industry or transportation industry. So I said, what can we do? And we believe that it made good business sense to actually differentiate ourselves by limiting the amount of carbon we're putting out there. We managed to cut our emissions by about 50% in total in the 10 years, which is equivalent to the entire energy consumption of Croatia, for example, for a year. This is very meaningful. And why are appliances important? If you take 4 product categories, and this is important, so I'll repeat it twice actually, but heating and cooling, refrigeration, electric motors, and lighting. Heating and cooling, refrigeration, lighting, and electric motors is about 40% of energy consumption worldwide. If you were able to use today best-in-class technology you'd be able to cut that by 50%. And what that means is that means shutting down 2,100 coal-fired power plants around the world. That is a low-hanging fruit for what we need to do in terms of decarbonizing. But what happened at Beko is basically this purpose that we had, which was to be the most sustainable business out there, actually transformed how we operated. It meant that every engineer from around the world, 45 factories, 55,000 people, really started focusing on decarbonizing the product and cleaning up our manufacturing process as much as possible. What did that mean? A simple example. Appliances, replacing a 10-year-old fridge cuts its energy consumption by 80%. But what do you do with that old fridge? They go into the landfill. Well, we built the world's first recycling plant because we couldn't find anyone to recycle them. And since we've recycled 1.5 million appliances, and 90% of the material goes back into production. All of these little things, low-hanging fruit, don't require huge amounts of finance. It just requires awareness, and they're very easy to implement. And that's always been my message. You take another example, DeFi. We have 50% market share in South Africa. It's a country where you have rolling energy blackouts. And they have no regulation in terms of energy efficiency. The average refrigerator grade was D, meaning it consumes a huge amounts of power. We voluntarily decided to sell only A, and all of our, everybody said, no, you're going to lose market share, it's more expensive, it's a very price inelastic market, it's an emerging market. Well, we were able to convey to the consumer that by buying our fridge, they were going to save this much in terms of their energy bill. And in 8 years later, our market share is 55% now, and the whole market has switched to the highest energy voluntarily because they had to compete with us, level refrigerators. What does that mean? It saved 3 500 megawatt coal-fired power plants. So I think energy efficiency is the most important aspect and lowest hanging fruit in terms of decarbonizing. It's a difficult journey because we have to compete against our Chinese counterparts, for example, who do not take sustainability as a driving force, or, for example, CBAM worries our competitors much more, whereas I'm quite comfortable with CBAM because we already are trying to implement using green steel and really be careful what our energy sources are. We've invested in more than 100 megawatts of solar power. We produce more than 50% of our own power that we consume, simply because I believe it makes good business sense. And people don't understand this. Today, the price of a carbon certificate is, let's say, $80, $85 or euros. But when the weather gets more extreme and all of these voluntary markets become mandatory, the price of a carbon offset may be 2,000, maybe 10,000, we don't know. If I don't cut my carbon exposure today, I'm not hedging against that future. And you won't be able to operate. It takes years to actually decarbonize. Our biggest focus has been on that, and I believe it makes good business sense because also today consumers, the latest Nielsen study I saw, 21,000 respondents, so it's a lot of people. And believe me, these young people are very, very angry. This is a problem we created. They're going to live in a future which is very difficult, but they are not at the table making decisions, and they are angry. And they will vote with their wallets. And when you actually survey them, today already they're willing to pay 10% more for a cleaner product or service. So I think essentially, if you don't do this now, as a business leader, especially a scalable, a very large business, if you don't clean up now in terms of carbon exposure, I don't think you will exist in 10, 15 years. In fact, history will look on you as criminal because the world we're leading towards is a very, very bad one. And unless we act now as business leaders, I don't think we'll be able to stop that. And actually, by acting now, you grow. I mean, 10 years ago, we were 3 billion in sales, regional at best. Today, we're 12 billion in sales and number 2 in the world. And that's without taking debt or equity. So I credit a lot of that to our sustainability leadership. And I think firms that manage to clean up like that will actually be differentiated fairly quickly. Sorry, I mean, long-winded. I was trying to be quick to save a bit of time for you.
No, that's excellent. Thank you so much. Let me just follow up on one thing and then one for the both of you when we come back on another round. presumably with the young people, you can, in addition to their willingness to pay an extra 10%, you can do what you did in South Africa and convince them that, you know, with a reasonable time horizon, their energy consumption is lower. So you've got both weapons, if you like, in terms of promoting the agenda that you just described. Is that right?
Absolutely. I mean, think about, so young people are a big part of this equation here, but think about markets like South Africa is a good example, but think about Pakistan, Bangladesh. We have about 40% market share in both markets, very significant, 200 million population in each, huge future, huge potential. I mean, penetration is only 11%, but I can't tell somebody in Bangladesh to buy the most energy efficient appliance, right? Because it costs more. And unfortunately, the global north is not subsidizing the global south at the moment. So it really takes companies to voluntarily do this and actually go after those young people and communicate to them that this is their future, that is at stake here. And they need to consume wisely and carefully. But one other impact that's happened is we attract the best talent now because of this. People don't really care about the money they're making at their work. They care whether they're making a real difference. They care if they can go home and tell their children that they're doing the right thing for their future. I think you know, it's making a difference on every level, but it has to be purpose-driven, and it has to involve young people at the table, at the decision table, on what you're doing. I mean, unfortunately, we're very far from that, and we're getting further away with the geopolitical, you know, developments of today. But I'm always hopeful.
Yeah, I tend to be the same. I had an experience earlier on, just before we turned it over to you and changed tack a little bit. Many years ago, and Victor knows this, the companies that were operating supply chains in the global economy were accused of misbehavior, not treating workers well. It's not environment, but it's a social dimension on a global scale. I was on the board of Nike at the time. Nike, you know, was trying to ignore this problem, and a very important woman joined the company from Microsoft, and she was given the job of communicating effectively. And so we had a set of, you know, code of conduct. And so she said to the founder and CEO, she said, well, maybe I'll just go over to Asia and see if we're behaving according to the code of conduct. And they said, well, you don't have to do that, we know. She said, nevertheless, she went over and came back and told the CEO and the board, the code of conduct has almost nothing to do with what's actually going on out there. And so everybody didn't like that message. She stuck it out. And then leads me to the question I want to ask you later on. This led to a process of, one, fixing those supply chains, I mean, really fixing it, but second, doing it with a measurement system that made it clear, right, that you were doing it. And that led to the production of a whole lot of informational intermediaries who were disinterested enough to actually honestly report. And so this strikes me as a perfect example of the kind of thing you're talking about. What I want to ask both of you is, have we really solved the measurement problem, the greenwashing problem, you know, is it true that if we randomly select somebody in the room here, give them the reports, they can tell the difference between what you have done and what somebody who thinks this is all a marketing problem? So think about it for a minute. We'll come back to you on that one. Okay.
Okay, thank you. I guess to start with, it feels odd to have a banker on this panel with such illustrious guests here. I leave it with you in a slightly different way, or think about for today, on the opportunity from a philanthropy point of view. Because actually, with the growth in wealth, with explosive growth in wealth, and as governments, in a way, take a backstage in all the geopolitical kind of situation, that private wealth is one of the greatest opportunity that will change the world. And Hakan has started this, right? Hakan has talked about how he, as an entrepreneur, is changing the way we do things. For us, what we've seen, we've been managing for 80 years charitable trust administration. 2005, we started the kind of advisory to clients of how to do philanthropy, how to do good. The difference why I'm sitting here today is the explosion of that discussion, an explosion of that queries has been something unbelievable. And you're talking about the owners of capital, the people who deploy capital, and people who price the capital, making that decision. So it's not just about giving money, by the way. I really think it's not about giving money. It's the influence that very smart entrepreneurs will make a difference to the world. And I think this is what we've been thinking about. And I just want to leave with you today, just in the conversations we're having with the clients, what the opportunity, because we're seeing a couple of things. We're seeing the older generation saying, looking in the future, I never had it so good. I was just at lunch with a client yesterday and was saying, you know, looking back in Hong Kong in the 60s and 70s and 80s, actually it was quite easy to make money and things were pretty good. I don't feel that outlook, and I think in that conversation with many of you, feels that way. So now saying like, I benefited from this. Maybe there's an element of guilt, maybe there's an element of just being older, but I want to do something a little bit different because I'm already wealthy. Can I leave a legacy that's a little bit different? But the major change, which I think you alluded to about young people, is we are having the greatest transfer of wealth that we've ever seen to a new set of people where the values, the behavior, and therefore the price of the capital and where they're going to deploy capital and how they're going to own capital is going to change. So it is a remarkable kind of, in a very difficult world, and I think Professor Spencer talked about Renaissance and paintings, actually is in the greatest turmoil and wars when you see the greatest level of philanthropy. And I think this is where we are now. But there are some challenges, and I want to leave some challenges for you, and it's an opportunity too. For the numerous clients we're speaking to, as they ask us about what to do, there's a couple of themes that comes in. It's deeply personal. It's about impact, because they're not so much thinking about, you know, can I do naming something, but it's actually the impact they're going to make. And that becomes actually quite difficult. Back to you, Professor Spencer, saying sometimes impact is difficult. But the biggest issue we have is they just don't know where to start. And when you become overwhelmed, it's like when you go to a restaurant with such enormous menu, you don't know what to order, you don't know what to do. And that inactivity, that's kind of paralysis, is something that we're actually trying to help our clients with to start. And what we're saying is actually, don't do great things at this moment in time. Just start. That is our advice. Just start. And that is what we've been doing. Why I guess I'm here today is, back to the point, it's a learning process. It's connecting with thought leaders like yourself in this room, subject matter expertise, but start and then learn and then go from there. And that is what our clients are saying that they want to do. And so if we look back in the last few years, what we've seen the clients saying, I don't know where to start. I don't know where to give. I don't know, do I do the big thing on climate change? Do I solve hunger? Do I solve poverty? Do I do something local or do I do something global? What do I do? And we keep saying, just start. Because if you start, then you'll come to that answer at some stage. And that's what we've been doing. If you look at what we've been doing with the clients, and I got a few examples of our clients we've been doing. It's, you know, one client seeing the climate change in the Philippines and, you know, the devastation every time a typhoon hits us, it goes via the Philippines. It just destroys it. And his question was, how do I build sustainability in the Philippines? And that's a very difficult question to answer, by the way. We didn't have an answer. And we said, well, let's start somewhere. Let's just start somewhere with going through the NGOs and thinking about how we maybe work with Department of Education with 2 or 3 schools to put sustainability as part of the curriculum in STEM. Because you put that seed in, and maybe 20, 30 years' time, it'll start. It'll go somewhere. COVID is a very good example. I think we've all seen the enormous damage that's been done on mental health. Now, we went to our clients saying, is this something you're worried about too? And they will say, we are, but again, we don't know what to do. So we said, okay, look, why don't we make it easier for you? These are some of the experts that we've talked to. These are what they're worried about. These are what they think that we could do. And we'll bring in maybe 5 kind of panels. We can bring 5 ideas to you, and you think about whether you want to fund them. And that's how we started it. And at the end, we funded a few things for the elderly, using music and mindfulness. We actually funded a few things for those that were deaf, and we funded a few things that were about children that, as you know, the suicide rate in Hong Kong is extremely high. Now, by the way, was it an enormous amount of money? Do you think it makes enormous impact? We can debate all of that. But what's happening is we started that process. Those clients have come back and said, you know what? I didn't quite like this. This didn't really work for me. Or this process is not what I want. Or I care more about X. So along the way, through maybe process of elimination, through a framework, we're beginning to kind of frame that discussion and frame that philanthropy. And you got to remember, the one thing that we're beginning to say about impact is what we're seeing is something like Hakam, right? Because these are subject matter expertise in their own businesses. So it's taking not only giving the money, but taking what they know or what they understand to make an impact together with money. So for instance, we were, again, yesterday we had a private markets conference, and one of the venture capital owners was talking about that one thing he really kind of cares about is healthcare. Now, we all do. And how healthcare should be proactive, it should be affordable, and it should be accessible. How do you solve this problem, right? And he said, well, let me think about using, I think Victor talked about taking technology into old businesses. And he thinks that's what I'm thinking about. I'm taking AI into the medical industry. If I can have AI nurses, if I can have AI, if he was giving an example, which I thought was really amazing, that those that suffer from diabetes feels there's something burden on them all the time. It feels like that they have to constantly worry. Would it be great if they don't have to worry because someone's monitoring this on AI all the time, tell them now in half an hour time or an hour to do this. So he's talking about this, but taking that idea of making money whilst actually taking technology and changing the world, I think is part of that philanthropy journey. And I think for us, and this is where maybe I'll go back to, I think there's questions to Professor Spence's first kind of point on recognition. This is something that we grapple with the most, by the way, in what we do when we advise philanthropy. Maybe it's because it's Asia, and we're taught, you know what, let's stay below the radar screen. Let's not be the politician. Let's not be the big person out there. Let's stay below the profile screen. And also, we've seen, frankly, in the last 5-6 years, sometimes being high profile is not great either, because society has changed quite remarkably in how it judges people, right? And things that has, you know, kind of what's happened 5-10 years ago is different today. So I think we as a team also, as Professor Spence says, if we are going to drive or help to drive that change and help those clients drive that change, how do we think about recognition? Because most of our clients tell us, I want to be low profile. But, and I thought this, I'll end on this, because we literally had together a team a few weeks ago with a client, and he spent a day with us, because part of our job is to not only think about this architecture of that philanthropy as we go through, right? There's part of it's about investments and everything else, but that's creating the endowment, the value for the next 20, 30 years. But actually, the greatest concern is, when I give that money, you know, is administration going to completely take it all away? Is it going to go to the right place? Is the right governance going to be? Do I have the right people on the board who's going to make the right decision over time? So we actually spend a huge amount of time doing the case studies, and again, having people like Professor Spence with our Wealth Summit in Shanghai, just taking subject matter expertise and explaining and sharing other stories with other grantors, other kind of experts. And this is why dialogue is important, because everything, we didn't have an answer. We don't have an answer, but that dialogue helped the client to come to a very personal answer on what to do. But I thought it was interesting. I asked that question on that recognition, like, you know, and he was very passionate about music. That was the area that he was very passionate about, and he felt he was in the music business. He felt that this could make a real change for children and take thing. And I asked him the question of, you know, how do you want this? Do you want to be broadcasted? Do you want to have a big thing? He goes, no, I don't know. Because he said, and I thought this may be the bit that Professor Spence says, because the people that matter will know, and that's all I need. So maybe recognition is about those that matter to that philanthropy, whether it's making impact, whether it is giving money. But I thought it was a very interesting thing. And so going back, why as a banker am I sitting on this panel, which doesn't feel like right? It's because banks have always connected, and we were built to facilitate. We were connecting corporates and capital. That's what we were doing. We were helping corporates and individuals from investment to capital. But I think today, our clients are telling us, not only do I want you as a bank to connect us with capital, but we need you to connect our wealth to society. And I think that is a change. And I think that for us as a private bank is that we ultimately manage the wealth of these entrepreneurs, and I say the owner of capital, deployer of capital, and the pricer of capital. If we're looking at this, it's a real chance for where wealth will maybe take a much, much greater role in the changing the shape of our future versus the reliance on governments and just goodwill. So maybe I'll leave there and then we can talk more.
That was fascinating. Thank you. Can I ask one? Thank you for that. Just one follow-up question. It sounds to me like everybody's on a learning curve, right? I mean, they're learning how to think about it. You're helping them think about it. My question is, are you also on a learning curve?
We are. Yeah. I mean, I think we are. I mean, I must say, you know, a few years ago, I don't think I would ever have this conversation. It's not that because I'm HSBC, I just don't think I would even thought about it. That because of that succession planning and what the clients are thinking about. And by the way, it raises everything. It's their corporate, how to do, working with our markets division, how to do a green bond. It's about our Southeast Asian tycoons that are in certain industry, how to transition, right? It is them saying, I need you to have this conversation. It is not good enough. Just tell me the return on my investment. I need something a lot more because also I care about my next generation. To your point, Hakan, about one of the things that we are, but you know, having this trust for 80 years is about building for the next generation, for the children and the grandchildren. And it's very hard. I think I can't remember who said it. I think it's the Wealth for Good. It's like, it's no point having wealth if you can't pass it on, right? Or the world doesn't exist to pass on. And I think we're learning from this, and where I think a very traditional private bank would talk about is the return on your money 5%, 6%, 7%. That multi-generational conversation is much deeper, and that includes the transition of a company, how to finance, and how to do good.
Terrific. Thank you. So maybe I've got the wrong end of the stick here, but there's an awful lot of pushback in the ESG world. You know, there's comparison of sort of, you know, ESG type, you know, funds in America and Europe. The Europeans seem to be doing a better job of sort of certifying them properly. In the American case, it looks pretty sloppy. And to me, this sort of suggests that we haven't totally solved the measurement problem. You know, we've got voluntary capital markets, but if you can't distinguish between something that actually reduces carbon on the one hand, as opposed to, you know, some, you know what I mean, the shuffling around that we've been talking about ever since the Kyoto Protocol. So where are we on this is for both of you, all three of you, where are we on the measurement challenge?
So maybe I'll start with some comments on this concept of greenwashing. In fact, there are three related concepts: greenwashing for green finance, and now more recently it's transition washing for transition finance, and now ESG washing for ESG investing. On green, it was relatively easy because in a lot of countries, including China, as I said, we have taxonomy. It's a government provide a list of green activities. If your project belongs to one of these, and you can get a label or sticker of a green project. And in most cases, it's easier just to, by glancing at the table and looking at the project, you know this is green. But in some cases, more complicated, you get a verification, right, from third party to prove this is indeed belong to one of the items in the list. So there are two elements to prevent greenwashing. One is you have official taxonomy. Secondly, for some complicated cases, you get external verifier. And in China, we had one more layer, which is to verify the verifier. Why? Because some of the verifiers don't work, for quality. They work for money. And if someone paying them enough, they will put a label on behalf of clients. That's why we also put into a mechanism for disciplining the verifier. If you're doing a good job, with good market reputation, you are maintaining your sort of a category A status, otherwise you are downgraded to category B, which essentially is unable to do business anymore. This is kind of incentive we put in place. I think for pure greenwashing, it was relatively easy and being addressing them quite effectively, at least in mainland China. Now, transition finance is a more recent concept, which is about channeling money to carbon-intensive companies for them to decarbonize. And the problem of transition is that it's a long period of time, right? 30-something years from now towards the decarbonization. So everything you do needs to be presented in the transition plan to show the bankers and other investors. And this is what I call, show them a movie. Well, a pure green project is like a picture. I do a green project versus a brown project. It has environmental benefits, right? So the demonstration of you are truly transitioning is very difficult. And that's why for preventing transition washing, just pretending to be transiting, but it's not transiting, we need a lot of things. They're not in place yet. Number one, a official definition of transition activity, which could take a form of transition taxonomy. Number two, the company needs to be required to present a transition plan, which is credible, with short-term, medium, and long-term targets, with governance arrangements, and all the data. And of course, we need to have incentive for them to decarbonize enough during the process of transitioning. So transition washing is a risk that's going to grow. We don't have the mechanism to prevent them yet. That's why a lot of work needs to be done here. ESG is more complicated because it involves so many indicators. Sometimes 100 different indicators, and a lot of them are social, governance related. There are two complications here. One is it's too many, and many of these objectives or indicators are conflicting to each other. For example, you serve the climate purpose by doing a wind project, which is reducing carbon. But at the same time, the wind turbine kill the birds, right? It's not good for biodiversity. That's one example of two objectives, confronting each other. And the other thing is many of the indicators, especially social, they are not uniform. They don't have a common understanding across different countries. Right? For example, in Western country, we say lady first when you go to elevator. In China, it's elderly first. Yeah, maybe elderly lady is the best, right? To qualify both. But sometimes they're different, yeah. So which indicator you want to put in and which threshold you want to put in to be qualified as a good performer for this particular social indicator is a very difficult thing to do. That's why first thing to really to do is to converge the ESG definition and standards to some extent, not necessarily uniform, but we need to have some convergence rather than hugely divergent system of ESG rating. And secondly, the ESG rating companies to be transparent on how they do this, rather than being a black box and only give you a score. And finally, for the companies or whatever financial instruments that's presenting them as ESG aligned, you need to be transparent as well in terms of which indicator you're using, which verifiers you're using, and what are the data backing your ESG performance.
May I? I have pretty strong views on this. I have to be careful because I want to be invited back. Yeah, I mean, ESG is deeply flawed, right? The problem with it is simply that the only thing that really matters there is the E. Because without the E, the S and G really don't matter. Unless we decarbonize quick enough. I don't know if you see the data that I see. I'm on the World Bank, this fancy name, High Commission for Carbon Pricing. But the idea there is carbon pricing is the only solution, and we need to get there quite quickly. Because if we don't, at the rate we're warming, our economic system collapses. And at the moment, firms like the one I manage are graded on a scale which gives a lot of importance to social and governance issues, which is fair. And each and every one of those are terribly important, but it takes valuable resources away from the most important thing, which is decarbonizing. And because credits that we can get are subsidized if we hit those ESG scores, we have to do that. We have to give equal importance to all of these aspects, and the list gets longer and longer every day. I have to know 3 layers down in my supply chain where the sand comes from for the silicone in the solar panel that we manufacture. Okay, it's important, but it's far more important to decarbonize the business and get those panels out there. So unfortunately, there's no change here. And, but there are bright spots. I mean, COP, you can judge it in many ways. I think Azerbaijan did a really good job by, at the very start of it, getting Article 6 through, which means we can get to a carbon market, efficient carbon market. But again, that will depend on companies decarbonizing and having to, efficiently work on a global market where they can offset the carbon they're going. So, there's so many things in the S&G which are very important, but really we should all be focusing on the E, is my view.
Very useful, a little scary. Is the carbon offset market working pretty well now?
It's not. But it was lacking this regulation where global markets can now operate with one system. There was a lot of double counting before. Again, the greenwashing is everywhere. You don't know if the money going towards this is actually, like we invested in a mangrove forest in Indonesia because it gave you the highest rate at the lowest cost. And that mangrove is important, but I'm a washing machine manufacturer. What on earth am I doing planting mangroves in Indonesia? I have to do it because I don't find a credible organization to give that money to and trust them to do it for me. But that is now changing with a global standard. And actually with efficient markets for trading carbon, it'll avoid double counting. It'll avoid the greenwashing in many senses. And that real market will actually accurately price the environmental cost, I'm hoping at least.
No, I got it. Let me go back to the wealthy people. What are they giving to or investing in? Based on all the work you do with them, are they biased? Are they missing things that you regard as targets? Or we heard you. Just get started, right? I completely agree with that. Piece of advice. Because otherwise you can just sit there, wondering, which thing to do, and it's probably better to do something and get on the learning curve. But is there, like for example, take higher education, which I used to be part of, and are they a target of philanthropic giving now because people think these institutions are important as the society gets, more complicated? What do you think?
I think it does vary. I think it varies from country to country and so on and so forth. But I think a few trends, okay, at least a few trends. Education not at the highest, I think it's kind of barbell. Education at the most basic level. Can we get the kids right first? Right? Let's start there. Can we get them into schools, into literacy, and be okay and off the streets? That's one. And then barbell and other, into high academic. Could they make that research that could have breakthrough and to make a difference? So we're seeing that barbell, the kind of end-to-end versus let's give it to a university, if you see what I mean. So a very targeted, I want to do this to fund that particular research into that science on one side and then get the kids. I think that's one. I think it does become very personal. And I think it depends on where it tends to be related to the industry that client is. and some of the bad things they may see or feel very strongly about. So what it's good in many ways is it becomes deeply passionate. It becomes something they're very, very strong about. The negative of this, by the way, is because they are entrepreneurs, they hold themselves to a very high standard. So if that money is given and it doesn't meet the impact that they think that they started with, it's like they invest into a X, they believe that they will do well because they have always done well. But if it doesn't meet that benchmark, they're quite upset. And that is so it becomes more and more, it becomes quite an emotional issue that we have to think about.
No, that's very helpful. I guess the final question has to do with kind of the level. So at Stanford, the latest large gift came from John and Ann Doerr. It established a whole school. Happens to be in the world that both of you live in. And it's pretty transformational, I would say, probably in the university context. It's named after them. Whether they're going to be disappointed or not, I don't have a very good sense. There's a discussion that goes on, at least in the part of the world that I live in part-time, which has to do with what's the relationship between the government and philanthropy. So people describe the issue as follows. The government's supposed to take care of people in certain dimensions, health, education, and so on. So why should we be funding the deficits, resulting from essentially public sector failures? I don't know how to get out of that. Maybe the answer is you just take the world the way it is. Governments don't perform perfectly. We got to look after people, and just go ahead. But could I ask any of you who are interested to reflect on that? Because I think that's another dimension in which you get paralysis, or maybe just excuses. People say, "No, that's the job of the government." We're staying out of that. So, relationship between philanthropy and the public sector.
Yeah, I think for at least two reasons why philanthropy are important in addition to what the government is doing. In many countries, especially developing countries, the government fiscal resource is limited. Its revenue to GDP ratio is too small to cover some very important social functions. That's why philanthropy should come in. And many times, I think these are foreign philanthropists coming to low-income developing countries to offer services on healthcare and other things, education. And the second problem is that a lot of governments are inefficient. Even if they have money, they allocate to areas and sectors and activities that was set up many, many years ago. It was not a dynamic approach in adjusting the expenditure priorities. And there's a very strong sort of inertia there. Whoever is using the money, funding the department with a lot of staff members already, they don't want to be canceled. Yeah, even if the final consumers or audience and clients are no longer there, and they want to stay there. And this is a type of inefficiency I think the philanthropy can actually address because they are, adaptive. They are smart and they can move very quickly to new areas. But sometimes I think also we need a philanthropy working with the government. If government wanting to do something but unable to move quickly, because of all these bureaucracy and institutional constraints, while the philanthropists can help some of smart guys within the government to do the things they want with the current resources outside. I think that's typically a very good combination of government working with philanthropy resources.
Excellent. We're going to run short of time in part because the first group overshot so much. Why do you climb mountains?
Why do I climb mountains? Well, good question. Actually, I'm not a mountaineer at all. I mean, I understood climbing a mountain to ski down, but I never understood people who climbed the mountain to climb back down. It just didn't make any sense, the risk you took. But then when I started speaking about sustainability and decarbonizing, I noticed that most people would either yawn or get on their phones. And I just couldn't get the message across because it's believed that it's the next generation's problem. The average business leader is a male, mid-50s, I wish it was, by the way, women would do a far better job. But I mean, mid-50s male who has 5, 6 years in the job, they really don't care that much. They may do lip service, they may put out a good sustainability report that their sustainability team does. Trust me, they haven't read it. So, you know, I just couldn't get the message across. It was impossible. And then I thought, well, wait a minute. Everybody thinks about Everest. Everybody at some point, you know, is mesmerized by it. And I said, okay, what if I climbed Everest? And in the preparation process of a year, I documented everything. I put it online. The whole company watched. And what happened is every single person in the company asked the question, why is this guy taking this risk? He has a beautiful family, you know, he has a great job, he's paid well. Why would he take this life danger? Why would he do it? And the answer was simple. I wanted to raise awareness on what was happening. And then it was the glaciers that are melting, which is a huge problem, right? Most people aren't aware here that 2 billion people are going to be massively affected when those glaciers are completely gone. They're 50% gone. 2 billion people. Can you imagine 2 billion people having to move onto other people's land? I mean, it's unprecedented. So the whole idea was to raise awareness, and it worked. When I came back, it was a very unfortunate year to climb. 14 people died the morning I summited. It was on the front page of the New York Times, the lineup on the top. Many of you, I'm sure, have seen it in 2019. It changed me, the experience. I became completely focused on this mission of really doing my very best so that I could look my children in the eyes when they're adults and say, I did everything possible. Everything possible. And you know what? When I speak about sustainability today, everybody wants to hear about Everest. I nearly died several times, and nobody looks at their phone anymore. So it worked. So since then, I've skied to the South Pole. I just climbed the highest mountain in Indonesia. There's a very interesting mountain in the middle of the jungle in western Papua that goes up to 5,000 meters. And I climbed it because the last piece of ice on the equator is there. And it's down to 500 square meters. So I took a piece of it to preserve. It will be gone in 4 or 5 years. And now I'm really focused. I've stopped talking about decarbonization as much because I'm a technology optimist. I believe we will solve that problem. It'll be too late for biodiversity. There'll be a lot of damage done, but we will solve that problem. What we are not going to solve is sea level rise because the ice is on a different schedule and there's nothing we can do to stop that. So what we need to be talking about is what land we're going to protect at all costs, what land we're going to abandon to the sea, and how we're going to move hundreds of millions of people to higher ground onto other people's lands. This is the biggest problem humanity has ever faced. And unlike climate change and warming, this is a problem without a solution. So we know it now, and we can't unknow what we know. We have to focus all our energy on fighting this. So I'm going to ski to the North Pole, hopefully in April, because I don't think you'll be able, maybe you'll be able to water ski there in 4 or 5 years. But I want to do that too, and then just focus, you know, all my energy on the sea level rise problem.
That's fantastic. You know, when I talk to people, you know, about what's going on in the world, social media, echo chambers and so on, I say, you know what? The scarcest commodity in the world is attention. It's not money, it's getting attention. And that's a brilliant example of getting attention to something you truly believe is important. No, that's fantastic. The other thing I need to tell you is we were talking at dinner, and I'm about to read Hakam's book about these adventures. And he said, where do you live? And I said, I have a place in Fort Lauderdale on the east coast of Florida. And he said, sell it, like yesterday.
Yes, because in 5 years, you won't be able to insure it. May I take 1 more minute?
Absolutely.
Just 1 minute. I've interviewed every glaciologist, credible glaciologist, geoscientists. I've been to Antarctica. I've seen it myself. And the whole world's premise is based on an IPCC report printed in 2013. This is very important. In that report, 2,000 scientists, is peer-reviewed, right? I don't expect you to read it, it's 7,000 pages. But in there, about sea level rise, it says the mean scenario is 82 centimeter rise by the turn of the century. That's so far away, right? 2,100. But there's a footnote. which actually says this does not include Antarctic and Arctic ice melt. That's 92% of the ice on Earth. Why? Because the scientists couldn't agree on how much it's going to melt. As soon as I saw that, I was horrified. Now it's been corrected, but it's all over the place. Nobody can agree. All we know is that it's melting much faster than all the consensus. My own estimate, out of all of these interviews, and I'm writing a book now on the topic, is that we're going to see 50 centimeters of sea level rise by 2050s. What that means is 30% of Florida doesn't exist. Half of Bangladesh is gone. Bangkok, London. I mean, what we're talking about is something catastrophic, and is very, very highly likely to happen. I mean, I'm not a scientist. I might be wrong with 10 centimeters up or down, but that will devastate our trade system. Think of the nuclear power plants that are water-cooled. Think of the trade system, the ports. I mean, everything collapses with that. Anyway, I can talk for hours, but I just wanted to leave that 50-centimeter message, and please sell your home.
Okay, all right. We may be running short of time, but I'm going to turn it over to you for if anybody has any comments and questions. So, floor is open.
Yeah, I'm Vivek Pathak. I'm with the IFC, which is part of the World Bank. I'm the Chief Risk Officer. But my real passion is on climate, and I ran the climate business for 3 years. The question I had is that philanthropic capital has typically been going in for sectors like health, education, arts, etc., very important. But we haven't seen leverage there. And what we need as we look at the climate challenges, how do we leverage $1 of philanthropic capital to get in $2, $3, $4, $5, $6 of commercial capital? And I think, Hakan, the answer is with you, really, because I think the world really needs to see what you've done, because there are parts of your supply chain and value chain which were probably viable to decarbonize from day one, some which took 3 years, some which will take 5 years, and some may take 10 years. And I think what we need to learn is, how did you do it, and how can we get philanthropic capital into this space so you can leverage commercial capital? Otherwise, you won't have to sell your house in Florida. We'll have to sell our houses in Hong Kong and Singapore as well, I suspect.
Shall I?
Yeah, I think but you both should comment on that, because Junma actually talked about that. I mean, I don't know whether you can attract philanthropic capital to sort of make up the the deficit, to essentially, to use his term, crowd in massive amounts of private and sovereign wealth fund capital to meet the investment requirements of the energy transition and energy efficiency. But so both of you take.
Yeah, maybe I kick off by saying philanthropy can do many other things the governments are doing in so-called crowding private capital. And the good example I want to cite is in China, we did quite a few pilot program for green finance. One of the places is Huzhou City. I brought a lot of foreigners and see their experience of how to use a very, very small public resource to crowding private sector money. What we did is the interest subsidy. They actually classify green projects into 3 types: the dark green, the green, the light green. The dark green gets 12% interest subsidy, green gets 9%, and the light green gets 6%, which means that anywhere between 6 to 12% of interest payments is made by the government. And the private sector, the project owner will make the rest of roughly 90% of interest. And this is only, on average, 0.5% or 50 basis point subsidy. But they were able to essentially bring the banks in to provide 100% of the principals. Yeah, so it's 200 times of leveraging. With $1 government money, the private sector contribute $200. And it's hugely effective. It's not a 2 or 3 times that you were thinking about, talking about. And philanthropy can do the same thing, either in the form of, this type of interest subsidies, or some sort of a guarantee, partial guarantee, or some sort of assistance on, project design, which you make a, project which is barely bankable to bankable. And that part is critical, and not many people want to invest, even the project owner or the lender. But this is where the philanthropy can come in.
My answer is simple. Regulation, regulation, regulation. And you won't hear a business leader, a CEO say that. Yeah, normally they resist regulation at all costs. The reason is we're not going to be able to stop someone in India buying an air conditioning unit when it reaches 35 degrees and humidity is 90. That's called a wet bulb moment. You can't survive more than 2 hours in that. They will consume. What we need to do is have a global regulation framework which dictates that the highest energy level product is sold, and the difference in cost there has to come from somewhere. And I think that is where government capital will be best spent, because this is the Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, he calls this the first fuel. You know, everybody looks at nuclear, hydrogen, etc., but energy efficiency, really, it's here. The technology is here. We don't need to discover anything. We know the solution. But because of this loss of globalization and this geopolitical tension, it's impossible to have global regulation, which I think we should all be pushing for, because otherwise, by the way, I also believe it'll eventually happen, because excuse my language, as the shit hits the fan, everybody pays attention, right? I mean, eventually humans react, and the first thing we need to do is have this global uniform regulation.
I appreciate your use of that technical term at the end there. Is this something that philanthropists would be interested in? Especially if you point out the enormous leverage you get.
I was going to say, maybe I'm a little bit more pessimistic. I don't think global regulation is going to come anytime soon. I mean, I think the thematics that we see is every country building their own resilience, right? Whether it's on food supply, energy, defense. And I think that trend, it's going to be a multi-year trend that I think we need to be realistic and therefore to come in. So yes, so I think it relies then on alignment of interest, for lack of a better word. And I think that's where regulations do come in. And I think on the financing side, I think we talked a little bit about, and I don't want to bore you about Basel III and everything else, it's how do governments think about regulations on banks so that it's incentivized, and to private credit companies, that incentivizes them without giving necessarily subsidy, but it's just from a risk weighting perspective, or how it appears on the balance sheet, to give the biggest leverage on this era. Because what this needs to happen, like anything, will require enormous financing. This is not something that can happen with it's multi-billion trillions of dollars. And for that to happen, certain regulations need to change. And I'm too pessimistic, unfortunately, that global people come together. So I think we probably need to lobby certain changes in financial regulations, for lack of a better word, which can happen, and get then the financing to be up, and then money can go into where it's necessary.
Okay, last question, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Thank you. My name is Tinley. I am one of the Asia Global Fellows. I just want to say thank you to Hakeem. I think we need climate communicators like yourselves, because science is there, but a lot of the times it's how you communicate it to the wider world to make sense of it, and also highlighting glaciers. I come from Bhutan, where the health of glacier is very, very clear and present danger for us and for our future sustainability. But for sake of time, I think I'll just ask the question directly, since we have people who work in philanthropy or work with wealth to direct philanthropy. So borrowing Dr. Rajesh's term, I come from the trenches in terms of when you're talking of working within the intersection of climate, education, and gender. And I'm part of a network of NGOs and researchers and thinkers around the world called Green Network, so Greening Education Network. A big thing that we're doing over in this network is, as we're looking at education system and leveraging education for climate action, how we are trying to green the curriculum, so meaning infuse climate literacy within the education system. And there are a lot of good work happening, but the challenge is funding again. And when you have a lot of good work happening, if you don't have the funding, the scalability and the sustainability of it gets broken. So my question is, if I can take back a source of funding or interest the philanthropists back to this green network that I'm part of, where they can put together or work with to get some funding, especially since education was brought up quite often in terms of infusing climate literacy within education system, within curriculum in schools around the world. Where could we turn to, or is there some opening out there somewhere that the network can go to?
That's a hard problem.
I just love being called a climate communicator. I've been called a climate terrorist, activist, but never a communicator. Thank you.
I wish I could tell you a really great answer. I think it's going back into the trenches. You need to go into the trenches and make your case. And I think that case can only start with dialogues like this. But I think the good news is there's far more people willing to listen today than I would say 5 years ago. But having said that, that's a lot of other people speaking at the same time. So I'm afraid, you know, you just start saying you started from the trenches. I'm afraid you have to go back in the trenches too.
Well, we don't have a silver bullet for you on this one, but please join me in thanking the panel for fascinating discussion.